January 10th started out like the best day of our marriage. I woke up early and made David's favorite breakfast, these complicated crepes his grandmother used to make. The citizenship approval letter had arrived the day before, and I wanted to celebrate properly. I even bought champagne and took the afternoon off work. When David got home around 4 p.m., I was waiting in our living room with everything set up. I had the champagne chilled and I'd even gotten him a little American flag as a joke gift. I was so excited I could barely contain myself. But the moment he walked in, something felt wrong. He looked at the setup and just kind of sighed. I asked him if he was okay and he said he was fine, just tired. I told him we should celebrate his citizenship, and he got this weird expression on his face. I poured the champagne and made a toast about how proud I was of him, and how this was the start of our real life together as Americans. He barely touched his glass. I kept trying to get him excited, talking about all the things we could do now that he didn't have to worry about his immigration status. That's when he sat down on the couch and told me we needed to talk. My stomach dropped immediately because nobody ever says that unless something terrible is coming. I sat down next to him and asked what was wrong. He looked me straight in the eye and told me he never loved me. Just like that, completely matter of fact. I thought I'd misheard him, so I asked him to repeat it. He said it again, he never loved me, he only married me for the visa, and now that he had his citizenship he wanted a divorce. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. I couldn't breathe properly for a few seconds. I asked him if this was some kind of joke or if he was having some kind of breakdown. He said no, he was completely serious, and he was sorry but he couldn't keep pretending anymore. I started crying and asking him how he could do this to me. I reminded him of all the good times we'd had, all the plans we'd made. He just sat there looking uncomfortable while I fell apart. He kept saying he was sorry but that he'd never meant for it to go on this long. I asked him if any of it was real, our wedding day, our honeymoon, the times he said he loved me. He said he tried to make it work but he just didn't feel that way about me. He said I was a nice person and he hoped I'd understand someday. The whole conversation felt surreal. This was the man I'd been sleeping next to for 3 years. The man I'd been planning to have children with. I asked him what he was going to do now, and he said he'd already found an apartment and would be moving out over the weekend. I couldn't believe how calm he was about the whole thing. He was destroying my entire world and acting like he was just changing jobs or something. I asked him if there was someone else and he said no, he just wanted to be free to live his own life now. By the time he finished talking, I was a complete mess. I was crying so hard I could barely speak. He got up and said he was going to pack some things and stay at a friend's place for the night. He told me we could talk more about the practical stuff later. After he left, I just sat there in shock for hours. The champagne was still sitting there, the American flag was still on the coffee table. Everything looked exactly the same, but my entire life had just imploded. That evening was probably the worst night of my life. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying every moment of our relationship, trying to figure out how I'd been so blind. I called my sister and tried to explain what happened, but I could barely get the words out. I started going through our apartment looking for signs I'd missed. I went through David's desk, his dresser, anywhere he might have kept things from me. I felt crazy doing it, but I needed to understand how this had happened. That's when I found the prenuptial agreement, hidden in a folder in his filing cabinet. I'd never seen it before in my life, but there was my signature on it. I stared at that document for probably 20 minutes trying to make sense of it. The date was from right before our wedding, but I had absolutely no memory of signing it. The agreement basically said I'd get nothing if we divorced within the first 5 years of marriage. Nothing from his assets, no alimony, nothing. Reading it made me feel sick because it was proof that he'd been planning this from the very beginning. You don't get your bride to sign something like that unless you're already thinking about divorce. I tried to remember signing it, but I honestly couldn't. Our wedding week was so hectic with family visiting and last-minute preparations. I wondered if he'd slipped it in with other paperwork and told me it was something else. The more I thought about it, the more violated I felt. I spent the rest of the night Googling immigration fraud and what my options were. I read horror stories about other women who'd been used the same way. Some of them had been married for years before finding out the truth. At least I only wasted 3 years, but that didn't make me feel any better. The worst part was realizing how many red flags I'd ignored. David never wanted to take pictures together. He never posted about our relationship on social media. He kept his phone locked and got weird if I was around when he was texting. He never wanted to visit my family for holidays. Always said he was too busy with work. I kept thinking about how stupid I'd been. All our friends probably knew something was off. My coworkers had made comments about how he never came to company events. My mom had asked me once if everything was okay in my marriage because David seemed so detached whenever she talked to him. By around 2 a.m., I'd moved from crying to feeling angry. This man had stolen 3 years of my life. He'd let me support him emotionally and financially through his immigration process while knowing the whole time that he was going to dump me the second he got what he wanted. I started thinking about what I could do to make sure he faced consequences for what he'd done to me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about how he'd looked at me when he said he never loved me. There was no emotion in his face at all. I was just a problem he was finally solving. The next morning I called in sick to work and made an appointment with a lawyer. I found someone who specialized in immigration fraud cases and got in to see her that same day. Her office was downtown, and I remember feeling nervous walking in because I'd never dealt with anything like this before. The lawyer's name was Patricia, and she was probably in her 50s with this no-nonsense attitude that made me feel a little better. I told her the whole story, the marriage, the citizenship approval, David's confession, finding the prenup. She listened without interrupting and took notes the whole time. When I finished, she asked me a bunch of questions about our relationship. She wanted to know if we'd lived together the whole time, if we'd shared finances, if we'd seemed like a real couple to other people. I told her yes to all of that, which she said was actually going to make things harder. She explained that proving immigration fraud is really difficult because the government has to show that the marriage was never legitimate from the beginning. The fact that we'd lived as husband and wife for 3 years, even if David was faking it, would work in his favor. She said his confession to me wasn't enough evidence on its own. I asked her about the prenup I'd never seen before. She looked it over and said it was definitely suspicious, but it wasn't illegal for him to have me sign it without fully explaining what it was. She said it showed intent to deceive, but it wasn't proof of immigration fraud by itself. I was starting to feel hopeless when she told me she wanted to do some more research into David's background. She said sometimes these cases break open when you find patterns of behavior or evidence that the person never intended to stay married. About an hour into our meeting, she called someone at a private investigation firm she works with. She asked them to run a quick background check on David while we waited. I was surprised how fast they could get information. That's when we hit the jackpot. The investigator called back within 30 minutes and told Patricia that David had opened a separate bank account the day after our wedding. Not a joint account, a personal account that I wasn't on and didn't know about. He'd been moving money into it regularly throughout our marriage. Patricia got really excited about this because it showed premeditation. She said people don't typically open secret bank accounts the day after their wedding, unless they're planning for the marriage to end. Combined with the prenup and his confession, it was starting to look like a pattern. She also found out that David had been in contact with an ex-girlfriend back in his home country throughout our entire marriage. The investigator had found social media messages and phone records showing regular communication. Patricia said this could be evidence that he never intended to build a real life with me. I felt vindicated but also sick to my stomach. Every piece of evidence just confirmed how thoroughly I'd been played. Patricia told me I had enough to file a complaint with Immigration Services and possibly pursue criminal charges for fraud. She warned me that the process would be long and difficult, and that David would probably fight back hard once he realized what was happening. She said I needed to be prepared for him to claim that his feelings changed over time, which would be harder to disprove than showing the marriage was fake from the start. I told her I wanted to move forward with everything. I didn't care how hard it would be. I wanted him to face consequences for what he'd done to me. 1 week later, I was sitting in the immigration office downtown, waiting to file my official complaint. I'd spent the week gathering every piece of evidence Patricia had suggested: bank statements, photos, emails, anything that could help build the case against David. The whole week had been surreal. David had moved out over the weekend like he said he would, and he'd been texting me trying to make arrangements for dividing our stuff. He was acting like we were just a normal couple getting divorced. I hadn't told him yet that I was planning to report him for fraud. The immigration officer I met with was this serious guy named Agent Martinez. He'd handled fraud cases before, and Patricia had warned me that he'd probably be pretty direct with his questions. I was nervous because I knew this was my one chance to make my case convincing. Agent Martinez asked me to walk through the entire timeline of my relationship with David. He wanted specific dates, details about how we met, when we decided to get married, what our life together was like. I tried to be as thorough as possible while also explaining all the red flags I'd missed. When I told him about David's confession on the day he got his citizenship, Agent Martinez raised his eyebrows. He said the timing was definitely suspicious, but he needed more than just my word about what David had said. That's when I showed him all the evidence Patricia had helped me gather. The separate bank account was the thing that really got his attention. He looked through the records showing David had been systematically moving money out of our joint account and into his personal account for 3 years. Agent Martinez said this was classic behavior for someone planning to leave a marriage. I also showed him the prenuptial agreement I'd never seen before. Agent Martinez asked me detailed questions about my memory of signing it, and I explained how hectic our wedding week had been and how David could have slipped it in with other paperwork. He made notes about potential fraud in getting me to sign a document I didn't understand. The evidence about David's ex-girlfriend was probably the most damaging. Agent Martinez reviewed the phone records and social media messages showing constant contact throughout our marriage. There were even messages where David had told her he was counting down the days until he could get divorced and move back home. I felt sick reading those messages, but they were exactly what Agent Martinez needed to see. He said they showed clear intent to end the marriage once David got what he wanted from it. Combined with everything else, it painted a picture of systematic fraud. Agent Martinez told me that based on what I'd shown him, they would definitely open an investigation. He said they'd start by interviewing David and reviewing all his immigration paperwork from the beginning. He warned me that David would probably hire a lawyer and claim his feelings just changed over time. The scariest part was when Agent Martinez explained what could happen to David if they proved fraud. He could lose his citizenship, be deported, and be banned from ever returning to the U.S. Part of me felt bad about potentially ruining his life, but then I remembered how coldly he told me he never loved me. Agent Martinez said the investigation would take several months, and that I might have to testify in court if they decided to pursue criminal charges. He told me to be prepared for David to contact me once he found out about the investigation, and to document any attempts he made to intimidate me or change my story. Walking out of that office, I felt like I'd finally taken control of the situation. For the first time since David's confession, I felt like I was doing something instead of just being a victim. 2 months later, I was sitting in immigration court, waiting to testify against David in his fraud case. The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected because the evidence was so clear-cut. David had been arrested the week before and was facing both criminal charges and deportation proceedings. I'd barely seen David since he moved out, but he looked terrible when they brought him into the courtroom. He'd lost weight and looked like he hadn't been sleeping. Part of me felt sorry for him, but then I remembered everything he'd put me through. David's lawyer had been trying to build a defense around the idea that his feelings had genuinely changed over time, and that the marriage had been real when it started. They were claiming that people fall out of love all the time, and that doesn't make a marriage fraudulent from the beginning. When it was my turn to testify, the prosecutor asked me to walk through the timeline again. I explained how David had pursued me, how quickly we'd gotten married, and how distant he'd been throughout our relationship. I talked about finding the prenup I'd never seen and the secret bank account he'd opened. The hardest part was when they asked me to read some of David's messages to his ex-girlfriend out loud. There were texts from our honeymoon where he'd told her he was miserable and counting down the days until he could come home. There were messages from our first anniversary where he'd said being married to me was like being in prison. David's lawyer tried to make me look vindictive during cross-examination. He asked if I was angry about the divorce and if I was trying to get revenge on David for leaving me. I told him I was hurt, but that I was there because David had committed fraud, not because I wanted to get back at him. The most dramatic moment came when David himself took the stand. His lawyer had him tell this story about how he'd genuinely fallen in love with me at first, but that his feelings had faded over time. He said he'd tried to make the marriage work but eventually realized he couldn't keep pretending. But then the prosecutor started asking him about specific evidence. David couldn't explain why he'd opened a secret bank account the day after our wedding if he'd been genuinely committed to the marriage. He couldn't explain the prenup that I'd never seen. Most damaging, He couldn't explain the messages to his ex-girlfriend that started during our engagement. That's when David broke down and started begging the judge for mercy. He said he did care about me, even if he hadn't loved me the way a husband should. He said he'd never meant to hurt me, and that he'd tried to be a good husband even though his heart wasn't in it. The judge wasn't having any of it. She'd been reviewing the evidence throughout the trial, and she said the pattern was clear from the beginning. David had married me solely to get his green card, and he'd been planning his exit strategy from day one. But the final nail in the coffin was when the prosecutor presented evidence that David had been in constant contact with his ex-girlfriend throughout our entire marriage, including making plans for her to move to the U.S. once he got his citizenship. The judge said this showed he'd never intended to build a real life with me at all. When the judge announced her verdict, she said the evidence of fraud was overwhelming, and that David's citizenship would be revoked immediately. She sentenced him to 6 months in jail followed by deportation. David started crying when he heard the sentence, but I felt nothing but relief. Epilogue *. It's been 6 months since the trial ended, and I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. David was deported back to his home country after serving his jail sentence, and I heard through the grapevine that he's back together with his ex-girlfriend. I guess he got what he wanted in the end, just not the way he planned. The divorce was finalized pretty quickly once his fraud conviction came through. The prenup he tricked me into signing was thrown out by the judge, so I ended up getting half of everything we'd accumulated during the marriage. It wasn't much, but it felt like justice. I've been going to therapy to work through everything that happened. My therapist says it's normal to feel stupid about missing all the red flags, but that people like David are skilled manipulators who know exactly how to fool their targets. I'm trying to forgive myself for being trusting instead of suspicious. Work has been a good distraction, and I actually got promoted recently. My boss said I'd shown incredible strength handling everything that happened, and that she was impressed by how I'd fought back instead of just accepting what David did to me. It felt good to be recognized for something positive. I'm not ready to date again yet, but I'm not ruling it out forever. I've learned a lot about red flags and trusting my instincts. Next time someone seems too good to be true or pushes for commitment really quickly, I'll know to slow down and ask more questions. The whole experience taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was. 6 months ago I was a complete mess, but I managed to build a case, testify in court, and get justice for what happened to me. I'm proud of myself for fighting back instead of just letting David get away with it.